I remember when my youngest son was about 10, 11 years old, and my husband took him away for a weekend to have the talk about sex. And I remember when he came back from that talk and he looked at me with these new eyes of, oh my goodness, like I'm looking at my mom and now I understand what sex is. And he verbalized that and he's like, Mom, like Dad told me all this stuff about sex and I just have to tell you, I feel like I'm too young to know these things. And I said, hey, I know, buddy, but we really want to talk to you about sex before you hear about it from the world and just the media and your friends. Like, we want to give you a good framework for that. And he said, yeah, I get that. Well, my son went away to play and then he came back a few hours later and he said, Mom, I've been thinking the way the world is going, I'm gonna have to have this talk with my kids when they're like 4 years old. And boy, was he prophetic when he said that. That was probably about like 9 or 10 years ago. And I look at where we are today and I tell parents that they do need to start talking to their kids about sex at about 3 or 4 years old. Why? Because everyone's talking to 3 or 4-year-olds about how to understand their bodies and their gender and their sexuality. And we as parents really want to have a strong voice and framing that for them. And so, no, you don't have to sit them down and have the full talk for a toddler or a 3 or 4-year-old. But what you really need to be doing is creating that conversation to where it's normal to have talks about sex. Not just when you take them away for a weekend, but throughout the day and throughout the week and throughout the years and throughout different questions that they have. You want to establish the idea that you are a safe place to go to when your kids have real questions about sexual desire, about their bodies, about their confusion, or about masturbation or pornography. If you don't have those conversations very early on, the reality is the media and the culture is going to have that conversation for you. And so you start at a very early level, at a very basic level with what your kids can understand. And it can be calling the body parts what they actually are instead of making up fun names, but talking about how our bodies have beauty to them and they have function to them, about this is how we reproduce, how we make babies, and there's some great resources, books that you can use at different ages to actually articulate that to kids, whether they're 3 or 4 or 5 or all the way into the teen years. And so you're looking for age-appropriate ways to actually give them the vocabulary so that they can talk to you about sex. Now, when you get into those ages of 7 or 8, it's important to have conversations with them, yes, about the goodness of sex, but also about things that they're likely to encounter, like images that are pornographic. And again, there are resources that can explain the difference between what you might call good pictures and bad pictures, and why certain parts of our body are unique and special. You don't want to add shame to that, but say, hey, we treat different parts of our bodies differently. And that's why we wear clothes over certain parts of our body. And that's why we don't look at people when they're naked. That's why we don't allow people to touch us in certain places, because those are special parts that God created in our body. And here's what the purpose of them is. And then you've got to recognize that around the ages of 10 to 12, because of technology and just where culture is going, your child will be exposed to things like pornographic images, and they will be facing questions about how do we define gender and what do we do with sexual drive and desire. And that's where you are going to need to get into more detailed conversations about just why God gave us sexual drive and desire and how do we steward that. And I really encourage you as a parent to do your own work in pursuing sexual healing and wholeness. Now, why is that so key? Because a lot of the times when we get into those tender and sensitive conversations, we hold back because we haven't dealt with our own pain. We haven't dealt with maybe the shame of things that we've done in the past. We're afraid that our kids are going to ask us what we did with our sexuality. And when we've walked through that ourselves, we can now say with greater security and confidence that, this is what happened to me when I was a teenager, or these are some choices that I made that now when I look back, I regret, or this is what I've learned over the years. And so when you're talking to your kids about sex, you're also a mentor to them. You're saying, hey, let me pass on the wisdom that I've learned through the years, and I'd love to save you from some of the pain that I experienced when I was your age. With also realizing that the culture that our kids are growing up in today is very different from the culture that we grew up in. Having sexual conversations is much more normal to them. There's a lot of introduction of just what does sexual desires and drives mean? Our kids are asking questions that we never even thought of when we were their age. And so we want to continually be in that learning mode as well. One of the things that has really helped me as a parent is, instead of thinking about sexually educating my kids, I think about sexually discipling them. How do I walk with them on the journey of stewarding their sexuality in a way that reflects God's design and that deals with the nuance and the struggle and, in some cases, the pain that they might be walking through? How do I really help them become just mature human beings and not just tell them, do this behavior or don't do that behavior? That's really the heart of a parent, and we want to apply that to the sexual conversation as well.